So I'm really thrilled to introduce our two speakers today, Jeff Marlow and Rebecca Helm. By way of introduction, Jeff Marlow is an assistant professor of biology at BU at Boston University. He received his BS from Washington University in St. Louis, a master's in philosophy from the Imperial College in London, and a PhD from the California Institute of Technology. We're super psyched to have him here at a COBRA webinar because of all of his experience with the high seas, but also noting one of his PhD students, Aaron Freitz, is a 2023 COBRA fellow, so he's part of the COBRA family. Jeff is interested in microbial communities and how they take shape and are shaped by their environment. And he focuses on coastal salt marshes, seafloor methane seeps, hydrothermal vents, polymetallic nodule fields, lava flows, all sorts of different habitats. But he was also really involved with and really on the ground floor. I think you might even see a tour of it today at the UN while he was working, while the treaty was being the language was being drafted, and he brings his expertise not as just as a scientist, but as an explorer. And to that end, he's a National Geographic Emerging Explorer, a SciLog Fellow, and an Explorers Club Rolex Explorer. And as a writer, you may have seen his popular writing stuff in places like, the New Yorker and other sort of various media outlets. So we're really psyched to have Jeff with us, as we are also excited to have Rebecca Helm with us, who is an assistant professor at the Earth Commons Institute at Georgetown University. Rebecca grew up in Arizona, so much ocean, but completed her undergraduate degree in marine science at Equitable College, which is certainly a very marine biology focused place, and then conducted research on jellyfish life cycles as a Fulbright fellow in South Africa. Rebecca then went on to get a PhD from Brown, where she was an NSF GRFP fellow and an NSF EPSCoR fellow, and then got a PhD working on open ocean and coastal jellyfish species. So really cool species in the open ocean, and then conducted a postdoc at Woods Hole, and then later at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History as a second postdoc with the NSF. And so Rebecca was an assistant professor at the University of North Carolina, Asheville, before she moved to Georgetown recently. And her lab focuses on the ways that organisms change through time, evolutionary, developmental, seasonal, or daily change, thinking about all of those. She's also very passionate about ocean conservation, along with Jeff, and is interested in areas beyond national jurisdiction, which I'm sure is why Rebecca was so involved in the High Seas Treaty. So we really have two. The expertise in the room is pretty amazing, and I'm really excited to hear about the behind the scenes and what this means for all of us from the two experts. So thank you, Jeff and Rebecca, for joining us, and we'll turn this to you.
Well, thank you so much. Very generous introduction, and I am so happy I was able to grab Rebecca into this to get her expertise as well. So let me share my screen, which has our combined slides. And all right, I assume we can see everything. We're good? Wonderful. Okay, so our plan today is to kind of give you a sense of what things were like during the negotiations. Then the bulk of the presentation is really literally going through the text, and we've sort of highlighted bits that we think are most interesting, most relevant, and kind of specifically for this audience, the people who are doing research in the ocean, what it will actually mean. Big caveat up front, a lot of the specifics are uncertain, remain to be figured out. But there are some kind of big categories of things that will certainly change, things that will stay the same, and it'll be fun to talk through all of those. So here's our little tour. So this is the view of kind of what it's like, going from the security checkpoint into the General Assembly building at the UN, and then into the conference center where the negotiations happened. By way of background, this whole kind of process began in a lot of ways in the late 90s when a legal officer at the IUCN, a fellow named Lyle Glauca, published an article that was promoting the use of genetic resources in the open ocean. So in his mind, the international community was so focused on seabed minerals and the International Seabed Authority that they kind of lost sight of what he thought was the biggest resource, which was the biodiversity itself. he viewed this genetic repository as the most immediately actionable and exploitable and lucrative resource there was. Also around the same time, researchers were learning that the ocean is a vast, interconnected place with high inertia, and that our exploitation activities were having real and very negative effects. So 2 examples that really galvanized momentum were discoveries around the orange roughy, a fish that can live for a century. This was kind of discovered just as that fishery was beginning to collapse. And then a lot of trawling activities off the coast of Norway that were pulling up fragments of coral reefs. These deep, unknown coral reefs were being discovered sort of through their destruction. So in this context, a sort of view toward conservation was also beginning to gain momentum. And these 2 strands, the marine genetic resources, the idea of preserving parts of the ocean, packaged together, and the UN kind of began to consider how they might put this into a cohesive legal framework. Here's the rest of our tour after the checkpoint. So this kind of came to be in 2017. It was launched. They decided we're going to give this a shot. We're going to put this into one big treaty. It will be housed under the umbrella of the law of the sea. But the law of the sea had kind of just stopped or didn't have a lot to say at the areas beyond national jurisdiction. So 6 conferences happened. Each of them was 2 weeks long between 2018 and 2 months ago. It involved lots of people, hundreds of diplomats in rooms like this one we are entering here. For most of this time, people sat in these big rooms and heard through translation devices what was happening. They debated word for word every single bit of this text over the years. It was hashed out in many long sessions. So our hope today is to really guide us through what happened, some of the text itself, and what it could mean for our respective work. So this is how most of the sessions happened. Everyone kind of at their seats, speaking in relatively formal ways. Things evolved as it narrowed to a dramatic conclusion. We were led this entire way by Rena Lee, who was the president of the negotiations. We can maybe talk more about this if anyone's interested later, but I was struck by how a lot of these sort of regional groups came together, and partnerships that you wouldn't necessarily think would exist between, say, Cuba and Sierra Leone here were really leading the show in some respects. So it led to some very interesting partnerships. And a lot of this at the very end really happened in smaller groups and less formal spaces as it hurtled toward this conclusion that we were very nervous about whether or not it would really come together. So Rebecca will take over with her perspective of how she got involved.
Yeah, so thank you. And if you don't mind driving, I'll tell you when to advance. So I became involved with this in 2018 and 2019 when I began really actively researching areas of the high seas that are impacted by human activity. So a decent amount of my work actually occurs within an area that's unfortunately known as the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, colloquially, although, the North Pacific Subtropical Gyre Convergence Zone for those marine biologists is the more pollution agnostic term. And one of the big questions that I think we all have as marine ecologists or biologists interested in conservation is what resources exist for us in the event that we discover something that is very fragile, whether that be an endemic species that only exists in one part of the ocean or a particular habitat that's been degraded through some activity that we were unaware of or poorly aware of. What's next? What's the next step? So if you find an area that's being impacted by human activity, what can you do? And the answer, unfortunately, as I began poking around, was very little. And the negotiations around BB&J were, and I think are, a big answer to that question. So I ended up leading a group of scientists to write a letter for science. Yep, so there we all are, sort of advocating for strong high seas treaty. And we did this through the lens of really environmental protection, although there are many different aspects of this treaty. And if you click to the next slide, you'll see just a couple of the things that we sort of called for. So fully protected, marine protected areas for these fragile habitats is, right near the top of everybody's list of important asks. And it actually ties in a very important way financially to things like marine genetic resources that Jeff talked about. In addition to that, a robust framework for environmental impact assessments for any large scale activities on the high seas, excluding, of course, fishing, which is covered through regional fisheries management organizations, and mining, which is covered by the ISA. And then we also wanted strong implementation, including an administrative body, a decision-making body, a compliance committee, and then perhaps most importantly for this audience, a scientific and technical body that has an influence over decision-making. So it's not just scientists sort of sitting off to the side, twiddling their thumbs. They're actually integrated into these processes in some way. So, great. And I wanted to throw this in because, oh yes, and thank you, Beth, for that. So the acronym BB&J, for those of us that have been in the thick of it, is biodiversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction, or biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And it's sort of the shorthand for this implementing agreement. I just wanted to throw this in because this is, to my knowledge, one of the only negotiations that lasted well past the actual day and time deadline. So we had a deadline for Friday afternoon. The negotiations continued nonstop to Saturday evening. And I don't think I've ever seen anything more impressive as an intellectual, right? Because my brain was pretty much goo by mid-morning, like this guy right here. Many people were sleeping all over the UN. And yet, despite that, if you sort of advance forward, the negotiators were deeply involved in this process, and the president, Reina, truly didn't sleep for that entire time and was actively involved in work. Now, hilariously, on Saturday, we got kicked out of several of our rooms because the UN, model UN group, so high school students, there you can see them all queued up in the line, were there to practice being at the UN. And so the actual UN delegates had to go work in the coffee shop, which is what you can see in the other picture. So they were all sort of doing this very important work in a closed down coffee shop. And we were all sort of watching them as onlookers with bated breath. And here's sort of the final moment, lots of joy and tears of the announcement.
Good evening-ish, ladies and gentlemen. The ship has reached the shore.
At this point, I would say half the people sitting in the back row with me were crying. I started crying a little bit later. It was an exhausting experience, and we weren't even doing anything. So all of us observers were there to sort of support delegates and delegations as much as possible. So we were all off the hook. I can't imagine how difficult it was for the folks who are actually involved in this process. So yeah, so the ship reached the shore, but in what condition? And that is what Jeff and I are going to talk about today. So I don't remember what the next slide is. Yes, so the big question that I had, a lot of us had kind of going forward, was whether or not we got something really robust, or whether we got something that sort of represented a little bit more of a compromise to the point of lack of real utility. And I'm happy to say that for many things, we actually got a pretty robust treaty, which is good. So not the rust bucket, but something actually quite a bit better. So now I will focus a little bit on some of these calls that we made, but then in addition to that, we're actually going to go through every single part of the treaty to some degree. So establishment of marine protected areas and EIAs, but there's a lot of other stuff. All right, so Jeff, do you want to take it over with general provisions?
Sounds
or
good.
No? Okay, this is me. So yes, let me talk a little bit about general provisions. These are sort of the list of definitions and things that you might not find particularly interesting it turns out that all of these general provisions, though, have, remarkable importance. And these definitions are how we were able to squeak some things through, like, for example, proteins and small molecules being included in the definition of marine genetic resources. Okay, so being as this is an implementing agreement under UNCLOS, the general provisions and various definitions sort of had to call back to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. So that is what that stands for. And by implementing agreement, essentially this means that the Convention on the Law of the Sea has a call for protection of biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, but how that biodiversity is protected and what that protection looks like had not been worked out. And so a big push for BB&J is to really figure out those mechanics of what actual protection looks like. So for example, area-based management tools, every single tool has to be defined. So in the case of area-based management, this includes marine protected areas. And these have to be sort of areas where, we have potential important ecological species or communities. And one of the nice things about the way the marine protected areas and area-based management tools worked out is that, at least according to my understanding, and I know we have several people here who are on delegations, there is a possibility for including fish, for example, in MPAs, which is not something that was always guaranteed. Likewise, if you look down at the definition of biotechnology, that is where we get our derivatives thereof. And this is where we have the ability now to include all forms of marine genetic resources, not just heritable units of information, as you'll see in the actual definition, as being really important and included in this treaty. So another important thing is the effective implementation of these tools. So as I've mentioned several times, this is an implementing agreement. So a general objective of this agreement is to implement the call in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. So there is some callback to that, and I'm often sitting with both side by side to sort of read through and figure out how the things in BB&J relate specifically to UNCLOS. Okay, yes. So in many ways, one of the challenges of BB&J is that it has to happen in a lateral capacity to other instruments. So for example, another implementing agreement under UNCLOS is the fish stocks agreement, and BB&J cannot override the fish stocks agreement. Likewise, the International Seabed Authority is actually sort of under UNCLOS in a more official capacity, and the rules in BB&J or the new policies set out in BB&J cannot undermine ISA. So the idea is that all of these bodies and frameworks will sort of work together to achieve these goals. So this is one area where there was a big sticking point. So I'm not a legal scholar, and I might sort of defer to the legal experts for more specific definitions. But a big area of contention for the United States, for example, was whether or not this implementing agreement would fall under the principle of the common heritage of humankind, or whether or not it would fall under this sort of broader idea of freedom of the seas. The United States very much advocates for freedom of the seas. This has different implications, consequences than common heritage of mankind or humankind. In the case of common heritage of humankind, that implies that things like marine genetic resources will be shared among all people in some degree or another. But in the case of scientific research, this ended up falling under the freedom of the seas. So we still have freedom of marine scientific research falling under the principle of freedom of the high seas rather than common heritage of humankind. Just a good thing to point out in case you ever happen to run into someone from the State Department at the US, that the Earth does not have commons. The high seas is not a commons. That is actually a legal term that we do not politically within the United States adhere to. We are more on the line of freedom of the seas. But nevertheless, common heritage of mankind made it in. And this was one of the reasons, to my understanding from the closed door sessions, of why it was delayed for as long as it was.
All right.
Great.
So I'll take it into part 2. So there were these kind of 4 substantive pillars, I would say, of the treaty. So we're going to go through each of those. This is the one on marine genetic resources, including the fair and equitable sharing of benefits. And this, to me, is the one that kind of has the most prescriptive repercussions for research on the high seas. So first up is definitions, of course. So MGR, this is something that had bothered me the entire time of how it's being defined. It's being defined as functional units of heredity. Some could argue that all 3 of those words, there's problems with each of those. There's a lot of DNA that we don't know what it does. Is it functional? What about sort of modifications to existing DNA and derivatives and all of that? So this hits exactly on what Rebecca was saying, which is that this all exists within a kind of conservative with a small c legal framework, because it's been defined before like this, so we're going to keep the same definition. Everyone seems to be comfortable enough with what that means, and it was defined in this way in the Convention on Biological Diversity, and that's the definition here. But really, based on kind of nested definitions and the inclusion of digital sequence information, more or less everything applies to these 3 different forms of biological stuff. So it's the marine genetic resources, which I would strictly interpret as like nucleotides, DNA, RNA. It includes the digital sequence information. So once you sequence everything and put it up on a database, it includes that. And then it includes the derivatives, the metabolites, the enzymes, often, which are actually doing the biotechnology. So it's all in there. It's just not always so clear that it's in there. Okay, so I'm going to have to start to zoom through some of this. I'm just going to stop down on the bits that are most relevant. So this applies, the MGR section does not directly apply to fishing, but it does apply to research, which is, I think, what most of us here are maybe interested in. And there are kind of 3 or 4 things that would need to be taken into account and supplied to this clearinghouse mechanism. So this is a sort of online repository that does not yet exist, that will compile all of the information and data of cruises beyond national jurisdiction. So this is the idea that you'd submit a pre-cruise plan. This plan will include, what you're going to do, what the point of this research is, what you're going to collect, where you're going to go, what methods you're going to use, when this is all happening, who's paying for it, how you're getting, researchers from other countries involved, and what your data management plan is. So this all needs to be supplied 6 months out. The details of this and pretty much everything remain to be determined by the Conference of the Parties. So this is kind of a framework. So don't ask what the, how detailed does the geographical area need to be? Don't know yet. That's the kind of thing that's going to be spelled out in more detail, I assume, down the road. So that's the pre-cruise plan. That's number 1. You go out, do your research. Now there's the post-cruise report. So this would involve giving, the information of what happened to this clearinghouse mechanism. There will be a batch identifier, which is essentially a cruise number assigned to all of your activities on this given cruise. You need to specify where you're putting the sequences, where the physical collections are, again, where exactly you went, and updates to the data management plan that might have happened. Okay, so those are the 2 things of pre-cruise, post-cruise. Then there are 2 bits of kind of how that information and data are being used. At this point, we're sort of getting to what the state party would be doing. All of these reports, all of this information is coming from the country that is sponsoring your research. So no doubt the US case, from my perspective, the US would ask for this stuff from the people doing the cruise. but they would probably compile these reports sort of at a larger level. So these reports are what, how this information was accessed after the fact, and how these resources were used. So access and use are sort of separate things, but they're both going to be kind of lightly tracked, I would say, through the use of that overall cruise number. For example, you upload your DNA sequences to GenBank, you would include that cruise number, and then the US, when they're assembling their report, will say this cruise has this number, collected this stuff, here's everything that happened on that cruise. Okay, so that's the marine genetic resources part of this, but then the sharing of the benefits was, as you might imagine, a very contentious issue. We'll steer clear of the monetary bits for now, because that's probably not as relevant for researchers, but the non-monetary aspects are things that we play a huge part in providing. So these would be access to samples, access to the sequences, usable data and protocols, capacity building, which we'll get into a bit later. All of these things are kind of the non-monetary benefits that can be shared, and if and when they are, kind of satisfy that component of the treaty of sharing the benefits. Here are some more of them. There's a long list. I'll mostly skip those details. Monetary benefits, I will also skip, but head to Article 52 if you're curious. All right, to Rebecca.
All right, thank you. Well, first I see a question in the chat, so I'll go ahead and try to address that. So Amy asked, it's not clear why we need more oversight of research as opposed to exploitive activities on the high seas. Okay, so that's a great comment and worthy of a little bit of dissection. So, and actually relates to this part right here. So essentially there are a few things related to those two definitions we talked about, right? Freedom of the seas versus common heritage of humankind. Common heritage of humankind implies that all human beings will be benefiting from these resources. And whether it be small Pacific Island states or countries with a lack of access to the high seas, I think this could relate to their ability to access these common heritage benefits, and also funding for the other things we want. So marine genetic resources, for example, may end up allowing us to better implement area-based management tools, including marine protected areas. So let's walk through these a little bit. So the goal of marine protected areas is to conserve and sustainably use areas requiring protection. So there is a use case in here, and the goal is to establish a comprehensive system of these area-based management tools with ecologically representative and well-connected networks. So at the moment, we are nowhere near having any strong MPAs established, but we are very much in the do as much research as can on your favorite area as fast as possible, and then have your state sponsor it as a potential future high seas MPA. So at the moment, if you have a beautiful part of the ocean that you really want to protect, now is the time to collect a lot of data on it. Eventually, because these things take a long time, the infrastructure will exist to receive these proposals. They will be publicly available, reviewed by the scientific and technical body, and they will also be accessible for different states to comment for a period of time. This was another very hotly debated point. Some states argued very, very strongly for a consensus on all high seas MPAs, that all states had to agree on an MPA before it was adopted, with the idea being that you don't want a couple states essentially refusing to recognize a particular area or not contributing to its conservation. But one of the things that comes with consensus is the ability to filibuster indefinitely. So ultimately, the compromise was reached that the goal is consensus, but there are mechanisms to move forward with marine protected areas, even in the lack of consensus. And so now I'm going to talk a little bit about environmental impact assessments, which should not relate to small scale science, but may end up being one of the primary ways that scientists use or communicate information to policymakers. And to answer your question about consensus, that's among people who ratify. So let me see. I need to catch up on the comments really quickly.
I would say, yeah, also on Frank's other question, the how revisable and adaptable are these? It's as far as I understand, like all to be left to the COP sort of in the scientific and technical commission. So you know, a lot of that is a moving target, and there are principles of sort of interconnectivity that are nice, that are in there, that give the sort of scientific seeding for it, but the details are not yet figured out.
Yeah. So yeah, we're missing some details. I think in terms of MPAs, there's potentially some really strong implementation tools, but for example, it'd be very difficult to implement like a mobile MPA. So if you wanted to implement a dynamic MPA that's following a particular ocean current system like a gyre, so for the Sargasso Sea, that might be hard, but some other aspects are considered under this. So for example, fish can be included in MPAs, which is not something, including commercial fish, which is not something that was sort of originally part of the discussion. I don't know if that's a lateral discussion that will have to take place with RFMOs, which are regional fisheries management organizations, but they will be involved, so that's good. And then in terms of similarity to the Nagoya Protocol, it was used in this negotiation. I don't know where we landed in terms of how similar it is to Nagoya or not, but that is the idea. Or it was in the spirit of the discussion, at least from what I followed. Jeff, if you'd like to add anything to that. Yeah, okay, all right, great. So we'll move on to environmental impact assessments. So I think the general consensus in the room was that we were pretty happy with where MPAs landed. Again, some of the funding or the potential future funding revenue streams for MPAs will be coming from those MGRs. So the idea is that MGRs and the profits from commercially successful marine genetic resources collected in areas beyond national jurisdiction will be partly used in this process. Environmental impact assessments, I was not as happy with where we landed, but we will walk through it. So first, for scientists, this will not involve you. This does not involve people that want to kayak across the ocean. This does not involve scuba diving companies. These are for relatively large-scale activities. So those large-scale activities on land or in coastal zones have to do some sort of environmental impact assessment, usually as part of state regulation. All right, so let's step through. All right, so the idea of an environmental impact assessment is to essentially take stock of what we know about the ecosystem before we go in and implement some kind of activity that could potentially have negative effects. And to one of the questions that was asked in the chat or comments about how little we know about the ocean, I think this is one of the ways in which environmental impact assessments on the high seas are going to be extremely challenging. So a couple things that were hotly debated was whether or not environmental impact assessments should include areas within national jurisdiction that could have an impact on the high seas. So for example, if someone wants to dump a ton of iron in their river as a form of geoengineering, that iron is going to run into the ocean, catalyze a bloom of phytoplankton, or so they say, and then potentially that bloom will drift into areas of the high seas. Should that be included? So that was sort of effect-based EIAs versus regional-based EIAs. We landed on a compromise in red, which is that those activities within national jurisdiction that could impact high seas won't be required to perform an EIA under this structure, but they will be required to perform some sort of activity under their own nation. And so there's a little bit of compromise there. So, oh, no, if you could go back. Thank you. Some things that are important is that if states are conducting EIAs within national jurisdiction, they have to make that information available through the clearinghouse mechanism so everyone could see it. The state is responsible for monitoring those activities in a manner consistent with their national processes. So for the United States, for Canada, for the UK, okay, China, maybe okay, but I think some of the concern is for states that don't have robust national processes. So I don't want to pick on any one state, but I lived in Namibia and I love Namibia. So hopefully if there are any Namibians in the audience, you won't take it personally, but like what were to happen if someone were to do something like this in Namibia, which may not have the same degree of developed state policies around these kinds of things? Would Namibia be able to monitor an activity within their national jurisdiction that could have major impacts beyond national jurisdiction? Unclear. They also have to ensure that the environmental impact assessment reports and any relevant monitoring is sort of reported. So that's all okay, pretty good. Not exactly what we wanted, but not terrible. So now we can move on. Thank you, Josh. All right, so in terms of thresholds for conducting an environmental impact assessment, at the moment, more than a minor or transitory effect will require an EIA. So that means that if you are collecting a small number of samples for your science, you're good. In terms of activities that are unknown or poorly known, that's also been included, which is good because I think we can all agree that that's like a lot of the high seas. And there has to be some evidence that they may cause substantial pollution or significant harm. And this is where things get tricky. So my hope was that there would be some sort of decision-making body within the Conference of Parties that would sort of approve activities on the high seas, so environmental impact assessments. So essentially you would have a scientific and technical body that would review an environmental impact assessment. There would be experts on deep sea organisms and ecosystems, on midwater and pelagic organisms, on neustonic organisms, all working together. You would evaluate whether or not there was enough information about these systems to even conduct a robust EIA. You would then make your recommendations, and then ultimately, the sort of the decision-making bodies would decide whether or not the activity could proceed based on the environmental impact assessment. That didn't quite happen. So it is up to states to ultimately decide whether or not they're going to conduct that activity. So if the United Kingdom wants to conduct an activity on the high seas, if the United States wants to conduct an activity on the high seas, they're obligated to report to the United Nations the environmental impact assessment, but then they are sort of allowed to decide for themselves whether or not they wish to proceed. Yes, so here it is. But one of the good things that happened is that unlike the situation that we are operating in now, where a state could decide to conduct an activity on the high seas with very little transparency and accountability, there is now transparency and accountability baked into this BB&J. So yes, so all monitoring reports, all EIAs must be made public through this clearinghouse mechanism, and the scientific and technical body may consider and evaluate the monitoring reports and make recommendations to the state. So I really see the role of scientists and the media in sort of watching this landscape as being extremely important. If, we'd sort of gotten my unicorn dream where, all EIAs were sort of evaluated in a central location by groups of people who only evaluated EIAs or did a lot of EIA evaluation on the high seas, if that were the case, maybe we as scientists, as members of the general public, wouldn't have to pay such close attention to what's happening on the high seas. But because this is something that states will ultimately decide, I think if you see an activity happening or being proposed to happen on the high seas that you're very concerned about, one of the best mechanisms now to ensure that activity is conducted responsibly, or if you think it's a catastrophic activity, the best mechanism to shut that activity down is actually just name and shame. So we have mechanisms for name and shame in EIAs. We have EIAs, so we're better than we were before. Maybe not quite as great as we could have been, but still something is better than nothing.
Wonderful. All right, so I'm gonna talk about the last kind of substantive part, which is about capacity building and the transfer of marine technology. So, one of the foundational thoughts of the entire treaty is not only to, share the benefits of marine genetic resources on the high seas and protect these environments, but also to make sure that everyone in the world is sort of able and empowered to do the research and do the exploiting as much as anyone else. So this was the first kind of pillar that got locked in as the treaty was kind of coming together. And it's, pretty general in my opinion so far. It talks a lot about the different types of things that could be done, should be done, the principles under which they be done. So, different state parties shall provide resources to support this. Great. And critically, they will be sort of done based on a needs assessment. So it's really meant to be kind of in collaboration with the recipient party to understand what the needs are and then meet those needs. So I know that this is the kind of thing that COBRA thinks a lot about, and there's probably room here for leadership in showing how, what good examples of this could look like. It's all that kind of, co-development of questions, providing and, providing tools and resources and knowledge and protocols and all that stuff to actually be usable, because a super fancy piece of equipment that breaks is useless. So there are a lot of types of capacity building that were listed. So like providing data, information, relevant infrastructure. There's really no need to go through these. There are a bunch listed in the annex. There's going to be even more spelled out by the Conference of the Parties. So, there's probably going to be a list, and you would realize if you're hitting some of these in order to sort of satisfy this aspect of the capacity building. There's also a capacity building committee. So this will kind of, it's made up of experts in the field with good geographic and demographic diversity. And the idea is to kind of do some matchmaking between needs and things that are available to be transferred, and make sure that this kind of idea is not just ideally not just a token checking of the box, but something kind of real. And this is another example of a place where hopefully scientists can play a role. All of these little subcommittees are going to be really dependent on technical expertise. So there's the access benefit sharing subcommittee. There's this one. There are a couple others as well. All right, Rebecca's going to bring us home on the institutional arrangements.
Yeah, okay, let's go ahead and click forward. So for this, I'm mostly going to talk about the scientific and technical body, although I've seen some questions about funding mechanisms in the comments, so we can take those in the Q&A session. But I wanted to briefly discuss the scientific and technical body, because I think that this will be either composed of people who are on the Zoom or potentially people that we as people on the Zoom interact with. So a couple wins that we got in the scientific and technical body is that scientists will be essentially participating in this in their expert capacity rather than as representatives of the state. So essentially the scientific and technical body is not an extension of any one state. It is a collection of scientists who will come together to review the various MPA proposals, environmental impact assessments, monitoring programs in their capacity as experts. So that was a very exciting thing to get. This is also very important. So there was some discussion about sort of middle of the first week of this last negotiation about whether or not the scientific and technical body could consult with outside experts, and they can. So one of my hopes is that we are all regularly talking to people in the scientific and technical body once this is ratified and enters into force. So the scientific and technical body will be accessible to you, me, all of us, And they will also be able to solicit information from us about particular ecosystems if the members of the scientific and technical body don't have expertise in those areas. So that is really exciting. And they will also be providing a high amount of guidance to other parts of the process with greater and lesser degrees of power, again, as we saw in those dynamics. But it's really nice to see scientists playing such a leading role. Someone asked earlier if these policies generally throughout the treaty are flexible given how little we know. And I think that's one of the reasons why we advocated for a strong scientific and technical body. The best available science appears many times in the treaty. I think the last time I counted it was like 11 times, it maybe is more. So that's always good as a scientist to see. But of course, as someone who works on the high seas, I know that sometimes the best available science is literally no science. For many regions, we don't actually have science. And so that's where the strong scientific and technical body comes into play, and their ability to consult with outside experts and provide their feedback becomes really important.
Great. So I've here just listed a few of kind of the summary points in terms of what is maybe most actionable for people doing this type of research. This is mostly in relation to the MGR section. So I'll just run through these as a reminder. Then Rebecca can kind of hit the high points of what's most actionable from a couple other perspectives, and then we can take more questions. So it did sort of, I think, got buried in the chat of like, why do we need more regulation of science, but not industry? So this applies to both. I'm just sort of framing this around people here who are doing sort of more fundamental research, but everything applies to commercial entities as well. And those bits of sort of monetary benefit sharing would apply to commercial entities in a way that they do not to scientists. That's a bit I sort of glossed over in terms of how potential profits would get plowed back into this capacity building and this kind of support of the EIA framework. So it would all be, sort of subject to these same regulations. All right, so what do we need to do? What might change? So first of all, this is a biodiversity treaty. So it's not about geochemistry, it's not about geology. You would have a pre-cruise plan, you'd have a cruise number, you'd submit your report at the end of the cruise after a year, provide all your data and like the physical samples and the DSI need to be publicly available within 3 years. A report on how this information was accessed and then used would need to be generated by the state parties. And the idea that this, the work that we do and the various sort of routes it can take are central to this, the non-monetary benefit aspect, as well as the capacity building. And like a broken record, I will emphasize that many of these details are to be clarified. So I know that's a little unsatisfying, but that's where we are for these bits at least. Rebecca, I don't know if you have anything else. Otherwise, we can take some questions.
Yeah, very happy to open it up for questions.
Wonderful.